In mid-February 1944, a German tank officer, Klaus Ritter, would watch from his Tiger tank near the Anzio beachhead in Italy. His massive vehicle, weighing nearly 60 tons, sat positioned behind a farmhouse with its powerful gun at approaching routes. Ritter had extensive combat experience from multiple campaigns across Europe and understood both the strengths of his armored vehicle and the dangers infantry posed in terrain like this. Through his field glasses, he observed American foot soldiers moving through the ravines below. Among them, he noticed a soldier lifting a tubular weapon to his shoulder from a drainage ditch 200 meters away. Ritter immediately recognized this as the American rocket launcher his side had captured and tested. German intelligence assessments had concluded this weapon posed minimal danger to heavy armor. The Tiger's thick plating seemed impervious to what their tests suggested the launcher could penetrate. Ritter felt no alarm. He watched the American take aim. What transpired in the following moments would fundamentally alter German tankers' perception of American infantry capabilities. This encounter represented a collision between carefully developed military theories and battlefield reality. The Germans had engineered an exceptional heavy tank for open field combat, while the Americans had created a simple rocket launcher for supporting infantry operations. In the confined spaces of Anzio, where the Tiger's advantages evaporated, the simpler weapon prevailed. The Tiger tank's development stemmed from German armored warfare philosophy dating back to their operations in France during 1940, when German armored divisions broke through Allied lines at Spring. They accomplished this with vehicles that were adequate, but not overwhelmingly superior. Their medium tanks carried guns that struggled against heavily protected opponents. French and British tanks with thick armor could resist German fire at typical engagement distances. German crews developed fear of these well-armored vehicles and created tactics to outmaneuver them, attacking vulnerable spots and coordinating with other weapons. However, the experience impressed upon German designers and strategists the need for a heavy tank with armor thick enough to withstand enemy fire and a gun powerful enough to destroy any opponent at distance. The need became urgent after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. German tank crews encountered Soviet medium and heavy tanks that shocked them with their combination of protection, firepower, and movement capability. The Soviet medium tank featured sloped armor that proved difficult to penetrate, while their heavy tank had plating up to 100 mm thick in places, making it nearly immune to standard German tank guns at combat ranges. German reports from the Eastern Front described panic among tank crews whose shells bounced off Soviet armor. Crews sometimes abandoned functional tanks when encountering these Soviet vehicles, believing they had no chance in direct confrontation. Germany's response was swift and systematic. Contractors received orders to develop a heavy tank mounting the 88mm anti-aircraft gun that had proven effective against Soviet armor when used in ground roles. The specifications demanded armor thick enough to resist Soviet tank fire at normal combat ranges and mobility adequate for offensive operations. By August 1942, the first production Tigers emerged from German factories. The Tiger represented a formidable machine by any measure. In combat configuration, it weighed 57 tons. The hull measured over 6 meters long, nearly 4 meters wide, and just under 3 meters tall. The armor was massive, with 100 mm on the front hull and turret face, 80 mm on the sides and rear, and 26 mm on the roof. This wasn't ordinary rolled armor. This was face-hardened steel plate, treated to make the outer surface harder than the inner core. The process made the armor more resistant to penetration by creating a hard outer shell designed to shatter armor-piercing projectiles. The 88mm gun was adapted from the legendary anti-aircraft gun. With its long barrel, it could fire a 10-kilogram armor-piercing round at extremely high velocity. At 1,000 meters range, it could penetrate substantial armor plate. At 2,000 meters, it could still penetrate 100 mm. No Allied tank in service in 1942 could withstand that kind of firepower at combat ranges. The gun could destroy Soviet medium tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, far beyond the effective range of their guns. It could penetrate the frontal armor of British infantry tanks, American medium tanks, or any other Allied vehicle from distances that made return fire ineffective. German tank crews training on the Tiger learned a new approach to fighting. Previous German tanks required maneuvering, flanking attacks, and coordinated tactics to survive against heavily armored opponents. The Tiger required only good positions and clear fields of fire. Crews learned to engage maximum range, using the gun's superior penetration to destroy enemy tanks before they could close to effective firing distance. They learned to position the tank with only the turret visible to the enemy, making the already thick armor even more difficult to penetrate by reducing the target area. They were repeatedly told that the Tiger was nearly invulnerable when properly employed. This doctrine received reinforcement from combat experience on the Eastern Front. Tiger units achieved extraordinary success against Soviet armor. Individual Tigers were credited with dozens of tank destructions. The heavy tank battalions, organized as independent units attached to Army Corps for critical operations, became elite formations. Crews selected for Tiger duty were experienced veterans who had proven themselves in previous campaigns. The training was extensive, covering not just gunnery and driving, but tactics specific to heavy tank employment. Commanders learned to identify good firing positions, to use terrain to maximize the Tiger's advantages in armor and firepower while minimizing its weaknesses in mobility and fuel consumption. By late 1943, when Tigers deployed to Italy, German tankers assigned to heavy tank battalions believed they were operating the finest tank in the world. This was not empty propaganda. It was a reasonable assessment based on available evidence. The Tiger outgunned every Allied tank it might face. Its armor was thicker than anything the Americans or British fielded. In open terrain with good visibility, a well-positioned Tiger could dominate the battlefield. Meanwhile, German intelligence officers studied captured American weapons throughout 1943, when the American rocket launcher first appeared in North Africa during the Tunisia campaign in late 1942 and early 1943. German units captured several examples and sent them back for testing. The weapon that arrived at the proving grounds consisted of a simple steel tube open at both ends, with a crude electrical firing mechanism, powered by two flashlight batteries. The projectile was a rocket with a shape-charged warhead designed to focus explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of penetrating armor. German engineers tested this launcher against captured Allied armor and against German armor plate. The results were not impressive by German standards. Against vertical armor plate, the weapon could penetrate approximately 3 inches under ideal conditions at close range. Against angled armor, or at longer ranges, penetration dropped significantly. The shape charge effect was sensitive to standoff distance and impact angle. If the warhead struck at an oblique angle, or if the standoff probe was damaged, penetration could fail completely. German test officers noted in their reports that the weapon was simple to manufacture and operate, potentially useful for poorly trained infantry, but not a serious threat to German heavy armor. The Tiger's 80mm side armor was more than twice what the launcher could reliably penetrate. The 100mm frontal armor was beyond the weapon's capability entirely. The reports circulated through German units in Italy. Tank commanders received briefings. The American launcher was a weapon to be respected in the same way any anti-tank weapon deserved caution, but it was not considered a significant threat to Tigers and certainly not a weapon that could challenge German armored superiority. The reality German tankers encountered at Anzio bore no resemblance to the open steppes of Russia or the broad tank country of North Africa. The Allied amphibious landing at Anzio, January 22, 1944, was designed to outflank German defensive lines south of Rome and force a German withdrawal. Instead, it created a brutal stalemate in terrain that negated every advantage heavy armor possessed. The beachhead, roughly 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep at its maximum extent, was a patchwork of small farms, drainage ditches, stone walls, scattered buildings, and narrow roads bordered by dense vegetation. Visibility was measured in dozens of meters, not the hundreds or thousands that Tiger doctrine required. The 58th Heavy Tank Battalion arrived at Anzio early February 1944 with 45 Tigers. The battalion was organized into 3 companies of 14 Tigers each plus 3 command tanks. The crews were veterans, many with experience from the Eastern Front. They had trained extensively in Tiger tactics. They understood how to use terrain, how to engage at maximum range, how to leverage their armor and firepower advantages. None of that training prepared them for Anzio. The terrain forced German tanks to operate at ranges where their advantages disappeared. A Tiger positioned on a road or in a farmyard could see perhaps 100 to 200 meters in most directions. The thick vegetation, stone walls, and buildings created countless ambush positions where American infantry could approach unseen. German commanders quickly learned that sending Tigers forward without infantry support was extremely dangerous. American infantry teams would wait in concealed positions, sometimes 4 hours, until a tank came within range. The Tigers were too valuable and too few to risk in close combat without protection. But German infantry was stretched thin, defending a perimeter against constant American pressure. Coordination between armor and infantry became difficult in the confused fighting. Tigers sometimes found themselves advancing alone, their crews scanning desperately for threats. They couldn't see until it was too late. The American 2nd and 3rd Infantry divisions holding sectors of the beachhead perimeter had been equipped with newer rocket launchers starting in late 1943. These weapons represented improvements over the original design. The tube was reinforced to handle higher chamber pressures. The rocket motor was more reliable. The shaped charge warhead had been refined to improve penetration. More importantly, American infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive close-range anti-tank tactics. Launcher teams were trained to work in pairs with riflemen providing security, while the gunner and loader operated the weapon. They practiced stalking tanks, using terrain to approach within 100 meters or less before firing. They were taught to aim for side and rear armor, for vulnerable points like the engine deck and the thinner roof armor, for tracks and road wheels that could immobilize a tank even if they couldn't destroy it. On February 16, 1944, near a town the Americans called the Factory, a platoon of Tigers from 1st Company supported a German infantry attack against American positions. The attack began at dawn with artillery preparation. The Tigers advanced in line, their guns firing high explosive rounds into suspected American positions. The German infantry followed, using the tanks as mobile cover. The Americans held their fire, waiting. A sergeant named Robert Mitchell from Company E, 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, crouched in a destroyed building with his launcher team. He watched the Tigers approach through a gap in a stone wall. The range close to 150 meters, then 100 meters. Mitchell's loader tapped his shoulder. The rocket was loaded. The electrical contact was good. The weapon was ready. Mitchell aimed at the lead Tiger's side armor, just below the turret ring where the hull plates met. He squeezed the trigger. The launcher made a distinctive sound when fired, a sharp crack followed by the whoosh of the rocket motor igniting. The rocket crossed the 100 meters to the Tiger in less than a second. The shaped charge warhead functioned exactly as American engineers intended. Upon impact, the explosive charge detonated, creating a superheated jet of metal moving at velocities exceeding 7,000 meters per second. This jet, narrower than a pencil, but carrying enormous energy, struck the Tiger's 80mm side armor. The face hardened, steel that German metallurgists had carefully treated to resist armor-piercing projectiles, offered no special protection against shaped-charged jets. The physics were different. Instead of relying on kinetic energy to punch through armor, the shaped charge used explosive force focused into a narrow stream that melted and pushed aside the steel rather than trying to break through it. The jet penetrated the armor completely, entering the fighting compartment in a spray of molten metal and armor fragments. Inside the Tiger, the effect was catastrophic. The jet struck an ammunition rack, detonating a stored round. The resulting explosion killed 3 crew members instantly and ignited fires throughout the hull. The tank commander, standing in his cupola, was blown out of the turret by the blast. He survived, badly burned and in shock. The driver, somehow alive in his compartment, despite the inferno behind him, managed to open his hatch and escape. The Tiger sat immobilized, burning from the inside. Its thick armor had been rendered irrelevant by a weapon German intelligence had dismissed as crude and ineffective. Ritter, commanding the second Tiger in the formation, saw the lead tank explode. He couldn't immediately understand what had happened. There were no American tanks visible, no anti-tank guns that he could see. The terrain made it impossible to identify the source of fire. He ordered his driver to reverse, to get the Tiger back behind cover. As his tank backed away, he saw another flash from the ruins where Mitchell's team was positioned. The second rocket missed, passing over the Tiger's hull and exploding harmlessly against a stone wall. But Ritter now knew what he was facing. He had seen the characteristic smoke trail of a rocket launcher. The Americans were engaging his Tigers with launchers, weapons he had been told could not threaten heavy armor. The evidence burning in front of him contradicted everything the intelligence briefings had claimed. The engagement lasted another 20 minutes. German infantry attempted to suppress the American positions with rifle and machine gun fire, but the Americans were well dug in among the ruins. 2 more Tigers were hit by launcher fire. One suffered track damage that immobilized it, forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle. Another took a hit on the engine deck that started a fire in the engine compartment. The crew evacuated, and the tank burned. By the time German forces withdrew, 4 Tigers had been knocked out by weapons that, according to German armor testing, should not have been capable of defeating them. The German tank crews who survived returned to their assembly areas shaken and confused. They had trusted their armor. They had believed the intelligence assessments. They had been told that the Tiger was nearly invulnerable to infantry anti-tank weapons. The burning wrecks they left behind proved otherwise. German intelligence officers interrogated the survivors, trying to understand what had happened. The crews described the hits, the penetrations, the fires. Some insisted the Americans must be using a new weapon, something more powerful than the launchers tested at their proving grounds. Others wondered if the intelligence tests had been flawed, conducted under artificial conditions that didn't reflect combat reality. The truth, which German engineers would eventually confirm through examination of captured American rockets and analysis of damaged German tanks, was simpler and more disturbing. The launcher worked exactly as American designers intended. The shaped charged warhead could penetrate armor much thicker than crude kinetic energy calculations suggested. The weapon was not crude. It was effective, purpose-designed for exactly the kind of close-range anti-tank work that the Anzio terrain demanded. The February 16th engagement was not an isolated incident. Throughout late February and March 1944, American infantry at Anzio destroyed or disabled dozens of German armored vehicles using these launchers. The pattern repeated across the beachhead. German armor would advance in support of infantry attacks or counterattacks. American launcher teams concealed in rubble, ditches, or vegetation would wait until the tanks came within 100 meters or less. They would fire at side or rear armor, aiming for vulnerable points. The shaped charge warheads would penetrate. causing internal fires, ammunition detonations, or casualties that forced crews to abandon their vehicles. German tankers adapted their tactics, but the adaptations revealed how thoroughly the launcher had undermined their operational flexibility. Tigers began operating with much larger infantry screens, requiring infantrymen to clear potential ambush positions before armor advanced. This slowed operations to a crawl and required coordination that was difficult to maintain under American artillery fire. Tank commanders became reluctant to advance into built-up areas or dense vegetation, exactly the terrain that dominated the Anzio battlefield. Tigers that had been designed for offensive operations increasingly operated in static defensive positions, used as mobile pillboxes rather than maneuver elements. The psychological impact was profound. Crews who had felt invulnerable now understood they were vulnerable to weapons carried by ordinary infantry. The confidence that came from operating superior equipment evaporated. American intelligence officers interrogating German prisoners captured at Anzio noted recurring themes in the testimony. German tankers expressed shock at the effectiveness of American anti-tank weapons. They described feeling trapped in terrain that negated their advantages. Several mentioned that they had been told American infantry weapons were inferior, only to discover that American launchers could destroy their tanks at close range. One Tiger commander, captured after his tank was disabled by a launcher hit that wounded two crew members and started an engine fire, told his interrogators that he felt betrayed by his own intelligence services. He had believed the briefings that described the launcher as ineffective against heavy armor. He had trusted his tank's armor to protect him. Neither the briefings nor the armor had saved his crew. The technical reality behind the launcher's success was well understood by American ordnance engineers. Even if German intelligence had failed to grasp it, the rockets used a shape-charged warhead containing approximately 1.5 pounds of explosive. The warhead was fitted with a piezoelectric fuse that detonated the charge upon impact. The shape charge principle, discovered independently by researchers in multiple countries during the 1930s, relied on a precisely shaped cone of metal liner, usually copper, positioned in front of the explosive charge. When the explosive detonated, it collapsed the cone inward, creating a jet of superheated metal that moved at hypersonic velocities. This jet had extraordinary penetrating power against armor, far exceeding what the weight of explosive alone would suggest. American testing had demonstrated that the launcher could penetrate 4 to 5 inches of homogeneous armor plate at ranges up to 150 meters under optimal conditions. Against face-hardened armor like that used on German tanks, penetration was somewhat less, but still sufficient to defeat the 80mm side armor on a Tiger at close range. The key was range and angle of impact. At ranges under 100 meters, with the rocket striking perpendicular to the armor plate, penetration was highly reliable. At longer ranges or oblique angles, the shape charge effect was less effective and penetration could fail. This explained why some launcher hits achieved kills, while others seemed to have minimal effect. It also explained why American doctrine emphasized close-range engagements and targeted shots at vulnerable points. The experiences at Anzio forced a complete reassessment of German heavy tank employment in Italy and across other theaters. After action reports from the 58th Heavy Tank Battalion documented the vulnerability of Tigers to American launcher fire in close terrain, these reports circulated through German armored commands in March and April 1944, reaching units in France preparing for the anticipated Allied invasion and units on the Eastern Front facing similar close quarters fighting in urban areas. The conclusions were uncomfortable for German military planners who had invested enormous resources in heavy tank production. The Tiger remained a formidable weapon in open terrain at long ranges, but those conditions became increasingly rare as the war progressed into 1944. German tactical directives issued after Anzio emphasized the absolute necessity of infantry-armor cooperation. Tigers were not to advance without infantry screens capable of suppressing enemy anti-tank teams at ranges beyond 150 meters. This was sound tactical doctrine, but it created practical problems. German infantry units in Italy were under strength, worn down by months of defensive fighting. Coordinating infantry and armor required communication equipment, training, and rehearsal time that frontline units often lacked. The result was that Tigers operated more cautiously, more defensively, limiting their effectiveness as offensive weapons. Battalion commanders who had once used Tigers aggressively to spearhead counterattacks now held them back, unwilling to risk the loss of irreplaceable vehicles to infantry ambushes. The psychological cost to German tank crews was significant and lasting. Veterans of Anzio who were reassigned to other units carried with them the knowledge that their armor could be defeated by weapons that required no specialized training to employ. New crews arriving at heavy tank battalions heard the stories from survivors. The myth of Tiger invulnerability, which had sustained crew morale and confidence, was dead. In its place grew a more realistic, but also more fearful understanding of armored warfare. Tanks were not invincible fortresses. They were machines that could be destroyed by determined infantry with adequate weapons and favorable terrain. This knowledge made crews more cautious, more reluctant to take risks, more focused on survival than on aggressive action. American forces, by contrast, gained enormous confidence from their successes against German armor at Anzio. Launcher teams that had destroyed Tigers became legends within their units. The weapons that had been viewed with some skepticism by infantry who wondered if a handheld rocket launcher could really stop a tank were now trusted and valued. Training emphasized the techniques that had proven successful at Anzio. Infantry learned to be patient, to let tanks approach within effective range, to aim for side and rear armor, to work in teams with one man firing while others provided security and reloaded. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical level. American soldiers who had faced German heavy armor and defeated it with their own weapons felt less intimidated by German technological superiority. The material disparity between American and German anti-tank weapon production became increasingly apparent as 1944 progressed. American factories produced approximately 476,000 launchers of all types during the war, along with millions of rockets. The weapons were simple enough to manufacture that production could be expanded rapidly to meet demand. Every American infantry company had multiple launcher teams. The weapons were standard issue, as common as rifles or machine guns. German production of comparable weapons, particularly a larger caliber rocket launcher, copied from captured American launchers, never approached American output levels. German units often operated with inadequate numbers of anti-tank weapons, forced to rely on towed guns and increasingly scarce armor. The tactical lessons from Anzio reverberated through subsequent campaigns in ways that fundamentally changed how both sides approached armored warfare in restricted terrain. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, American infantry came ashore with launchers and the hard-won knowledge of how to use them effectively against German armor. The hedgerow country of Normandy, with its small fields bordered by thick vegetation and earthen banks, provided terrain remarkably similar to Anzio. German tanks attempting to operate in the bocage faced the same problems Tigers had encountered at the beachhead: limited visibility, restricted maneuver space, and abundant concealment for American infantry made every advance dangerous. German tank commanders in Normandy received explicit warnings based on Italian experience. They were told that American infantry possessed effective anti-tank weapons and knew how to use them. They were instructed to avoid built-up areas and close terrain whenever possible, to maintain infantry screens, to engage at maximum range. These instructions were often impossible to follow in practice. The nature of the fighting in Normandy, with its small-scale engagements amid hedgerows and villages, forced German armor into exactly the kind of close quarters combat where launchers were most effective. American after-action reports from Normandy document hundreds of instances where launcher teams engaged and destroyed or disabled German tanks, including Tigers, Panthers, and various models of medium tanks. The industrial and logistical dimensions of the launcher's success extended beyond simple production numbers. American supply systems ensured that frontline infantry units never lacked for rockets. Ammunition supply points maintained stockpiles of launcher rounds alongside rifle ammunition and grenades. When units expanded their basic load, resupply was routine and reliable. German units, by contrast, struggled with ammunition shortages throughout 1944 and 1945. Rockets for their copied launchers were often in short supply. Crews learned to conserve ammunition, to hold fire until they had perfect shots, to avoid engaging targets unless absolutely necessary. This conservation mentality, born of material scarcity, put German infantry at a disadvantage against American tank infantry teams that could afford to be more aggressive. The human cost of the launcher's effectiveness manifested in the casualty figures for German armor crews in Italy and France. The 58th Heavy Tank Battalion, which arrived at Anzio with 45 Tigers, was reduced to fewer than 20 operational tanks by late April 1944. Many of the losses were to launcher fire. Crew casualties were significant. Men burned to death in tanks hit by shape-charged warheads that ignited ammunition or fuel. Others were wounded by armor fragments and molten metal sprayed through the fighting compartment when jets penetrated. Survivors often suffered psychological trauma, the kind that came from being trapped in an enclosed space while it filled with fire and toxic smoke. German personnel records from heavy tank battalions in Italy show high rates of combat fatigue and requests for transfer among crews who had experienced multiple launcher attacks. American infantry casualties from engaging German tanks were comparatively light. Although not insignificant, launcher teams operating at close range were vulnerable to tank machine guns and to German infantry protecting the armor. Men were killed or wounded while attempting to get into firing positions, while reloading, or while trying to escape after firing. But the tactical exchange ratio favored the Americans essentially. A two-man launcher team with a 60-pound launcher and a few rockets could disable a 57-ton Tiger worth hundreds of thousands in currency and crewed by highly trained specialists. The economic and military logic overwhelmingly favored the American approach. Cheap, simple weapons wielded by ordinary infantry proved more cost-effective than expensive. Complex heavy tanks that required years of development and months of crew training. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies closed on Germany from east and west, the tactical landscape had shifted decisively against German armor. Soviet infantry equipped with their own anti-tank rockets and grenades employed tactics similar to those American forces had perfected at Anzio and Normandy. British and Canadian forces used their own infantry anti-tank weapons that, while different in design from American launchers, served the same purpose and achieved similar results. German tanks, even the formidable Tigers and Panthers, could no longer operate with the freedom and confidence they had enjoyed in earlier campaigns. Every advance into urban terrain, every movement through restricted country, carried the risk of ambush by infantry anti-tank teams. The Tigers that survived to war's end were often found abandoned, out of fuel, or broken down rather than destroyed in combat. The German logistics system, shattered by Allied bombing and the loss of fuel production facilities, could not sustain armored operations. But even when fuel was available, even when the tanks were mechanically sound, commanders hesitated to commit them. The lessons of Anzio and countless subsequent engagements had taught that heavy armor was vulnerable in ways that pre-war doctrine had never anticipated. The invulnerable fortress of steel and firepower existed only in theory. In practice, Determined infantry with adequate weapons and favorable terrain could destroy the finest tanks Germany produced. For the men who had crouched in the Tiger's turret that February morning above Anzio, watching an American soldier aim what looked like a crude pipe at their supposedly impenetrable armor, the war had delivered a lesson that no training could provide. Klaus Ritter survived the war and was captured by American forces in northern Italy in April 1945. In post-war interviews conducted by American military historians gathering information for tactical studies, Ritter described the moment he realized the launcher was a serious threat. He had believed his Tiger made him nearly invincible. He had trusted German engineering in German armor. The burning wrecks at Anzio taught him that trust in equipment, no matter how well designed, was not the same as safety. Technology alone could not guarantee survival against an enemy who understood how to exploit its vulnerabilities. The story of the launcher at Anzio is not primarily about weapons specifications or armor penetration values, although those details matter. It's about the collision between doctrine and reality, between what military institutions taught their soldiers to believe and what combat actually demanded. German tankers were told their Tigers were superior to anything the Allies fielded. In open terrain at long range, this was true. But wars are not fought under ideal conditions. They are fought in terrain that channels movement, in weather that limits visibility, at ranges determined by geography rather than preference. At Anzio, in the close nightmare of hedges and ruins and drainage ditches, the crude American launcher proved more tactically relevant than the sophisticated German Tiger. The Tiger's advantages in armor and firepower meant nothing when an infantryman could approach within 100 meters and fire a shaped charge warhead through 80 millimeters of steel. The broader lesson transcends the specific weapons and battles. Industrial warfare between modern nations is decided not by individual weapons platforms, but by systems, by the ability to produce adequate equipment in sufficient quantities, to train soldiers to use it effectively, and to sustain operations logistically. The United States built hundreds of thousands of launchers and millions of rockets. Training emphasized aggressive employment and combined arms tactics. Supply systems ensured ammunition reached the front. The result was an anti-tank capability distributed throughout the infantry, organic to every company and platoon, ready to engage enemy armor whenever and wherever it appeared. Germany produced superior heavy tanks in limited numbers, but could not produce enough, could not supply them adequately, and could not develop tactical doctrine that overcame the fundamental vulnerability of armor to infantry in close terrain. For American veterans who carried launchers at Anzio and in subsequent campaigns, the weapon became a symbol of American industrial might and tactical flexibility. It was not the best anti-tank weapon in terms of raw performance. Larger caliber rockets and recoilless rifles developed later in the war were more powerful, but the launcher was good enough, and it was available when and where it was needed. That combination of adequacy and availability, more than technical sophistication, determined tactical outcomes. The Tiger commanders, who had mocked American weapons as crude, learned in the most direct and personal way possible that crude weapons wielded effectively could kill just as thoroughly as sophisticated ones. The mockery died with the crews who burned in their Tigers, killed by shaped charge jets that punched through armor German engineers had calculated was sufficient. At Anzio, in the mud and ruins of the Beachhead, the gap between calculation and reality was measured in the thickness of steel plate that proved inadequate and in the lives of men who trusted it to protect them.